Hello guys, Assalamu alaikum to all my Muslim brothers and sisters and the like. My name is Omar Abdul Fattah, or in English, Omar Abdul Fattah, and I am with the Ask a Muslim team, and today we are going to be talking about the theory of evolution. This is something that not only affects Muslims, but non-Muslims, anybody who believes in any sort of creator or ultimate being. This theory has had perhaps some sort of influence on them. And we are going to try and explain this theory in a way that can be understood in a rational, logical way, inshallah, which means by the will of God. So let's get right into it. Okay, so in order to understand what the theory is or how it fits into Islam, we first need to understand what the theory actually states. And the theory is based on two propositions or two concepts. The first one is called common ancestry, right? And the belief is that every living organism shares a common ancestry. So that's the first thing. The second thing is natural selection, and Darwin defines natural selection. I have his book right here. In his book, you can see it. There it is. Darwin defines natural selection as basically the preservation of favorable traits and the rejection of injurious ones, right? So the idea is that there is a struggle for existence for life, and basically any trait that an organism develops is more likely to survive, and it's more likely to be passed on to another, to its offspring, essentially. So these two concepts kind of shape the theory of evolution. Now, knowing this, what can we say as Muslims? How can we understand the theory of evolution as Muslims? And the first thing, conceptually, we need to understand that the theory of evolution, we need to understand its inherent limits. And the theory of evolution cannot explain the origin of species or the origins of the universe. And you talk to any evolutionist, any biologist, and they will tell you this. Even though Darwin's book is called On the Origin of Species, it cannot explain the origin of species, and I'll tell you why, put simply. Because Darwin's theory assumes that every organism can reproduce. It makes that assumption, okay? In this sense, many biologists think that Darwin's theory can explain the distribution of species. For example, why do we have so many different animals and stuff like that? They refer to Darwin's theory. But in terms of how did the first organism or the first life on Earth even come to be? That's something Darwin's theory cannot explain, because for something to even reproduce, it has to have the ability to reproduce, right? But how do you get that ability? That's a question that evolutionists need to consider, essentially. The other serious limitation of Darwin's theory is that it cannot explain the origins of the universe. And many biologists and evolutionists admit this. They say, yeah, that's not really what we're concerned with, and they refer to other things. So the theory in and of itself cannot contradict Islam. It cannot. Now, let's say many people accept the theory of evolution as a fact, right? And I challenge that. I challenge that assertion. But let us understand and try to refer to the evidence that they refer to, because they do call upon some evidence. And somebody who doesn't know how to conceptualize or understand this evidence may well be deceived into actually believing everything. Now, I don't personally reject everything that the theory of evolution states, and I'm going to explain this. But to accept it as a whole and to say that humans have evolved just randomly from apes or an ancestor of apes is just, in my opinion, absurd. Like, just absolutely absurd. So let's just discuss this. So what is the evolution, or what is the evidence that evolutionists call on? What do they refer to? Okay, number one, they refer to DNA similarities, right? They say, we've all heard that, humans and apes have like 96 to 99% DNA similarities. This is one of the reasons that, they say is evidence of the theory of evolution. So logically, if we think about this, number one, why are we even comparing apes and humans when we don't believe we came from apes? Does that make sense? Because the theory of evolution doesn't state that humans directly came from apes. It says that we have a common ancestor with apes, right? So it's like a branch. Here on one side of the branch is humans, the other side is apes. So why are we comparing the two ends of the branches when really we're looking to the base of the branch, right? That's one thing. The other thing, just logically, when we look at DNA similarities, we need to ask ourselves, what do these DNA similarities mean? Because we say, for example, that there's 96% similarities between apes and humans. What exactly does that mean? Next time an evolutionist or anybody tells you that, what exactly does that mean? Ask them kindly what it means. Because in reality, there are certain DNA, certain genomes, DNA particles, DNA, equations that are constant across any living organism. And to give you an example, for example, the protein encoding DNA, part of the DNA, is pretty constant across, it's pretty similar between humans and mice even. It's 86% similar, right? And for example, between humans and cats, there's 90% DNA similarity, right? So we have to ask ourselves, what exactly are we comparing when we're referring to DNA? And even like a human and a banana, they share 60% DNA similarity. 50 to 60% depending on what article you look at. But these are extreme similarities. And if DNA in and of itself is evidence of evolution, then we have to ask ourselves, why are, for example, apes not 96% similar to us? Why is a banana not 60% similar to us? In reality, a banana cannot do half the things we can do in reality, right? So we need to understand DNA evidence, their DNA similarities for what they are. In and of themselves, they're not evidence of evolution. They are simply evidence of DNA similarities. And let's keep in mind that as Muslims, we believe that there is a common creator, there's only one creator, and if that creator made everything, then logically we would expect similarities, right? In either anatomy or DNA or whatever it may be. So that is how, as a Muslim, you can conceptualize DNA evidence. In and of itself, it's not absolute, unequivocal evidence that we evolved from apes. Number two, the other thing that people or proponents of Darwin's theory suggest is that look at the fossil record, for example. They say look at the fossil record. We've seen, for example, in the past we've had, they've discovered Lucy, for example, in I believe Eritrea or Ethiopia, and they say she dates back to I don't know exactly how long, but people say that she is the earliest missing link. I think 3 million years or something like that, right? So people claim that we found missing links between animals in the past and animals today, and this is simply not true. And here's why. Because number one, Darwin's theory states that evolution is a constant process, right? Based on minor variations in traits, right? So for example, if we evolved, right, from an ancestor of apes, we wouldn't just expect to find, one Lucy or, a couple, even 1,000, because how many humans are there? Billions. We would expect to find billions, I would say at least millions of transitional fossils in the record, in the archaeological record. But we simply don't have them. And Darwin even recognizes this limitation in his book, and I've highlighted here, and he addresses it, he talks about it. And his answer, I hope everybody understands what I mean by transitional records. For example, if there's a cat and there's a dog, why is there not like a cog, in the middle, or like minor, transitions in between, right? We would expect that if Darwin's theory of evolution was true, right? But Darwin himself states on page 195 of this version of the book, essentially it's quite technical English, and I know we have people from all over the world whose native language is not English, so I'm just going to put it in simplest terms. And he says, I look at the natural geological record as history of the world imperfectly kept. So he thinks that this limitation is explained by the fact that the archaeological record is imperfectly kept. And as a scientist, any scientist who's going to believe this is something that you have to accept on faith, right? It's not something that can be proven. And anyone who believes in God, this is an argument that is still very valid. If Darwin's theory of evolution is true, why do we not see all these different, transitional records or transitional fossils in the archaeological record? That's something that needs to be explained. The other thing, to explain stuff like Lucy, right? Lucy and other, for example, human-esque things that people have claimed to find and whatever. First of all, we need to understand that we should never just be accepting scientists' claims as fact. Oh, scientists have discovered, a new half-human, half-ape looking thing in somewhere west of Africa, right? Don't just accept that. Actually look into it, look to exactly what they found, and actually go and see the exhibit if you can, right? Because when we don't do these things, when we don't ask these questions, we are kind of making ourselves susceptible to just blind faith and false belief in certain things. So we need to ask these questions. Now, I looked into Lucy, and apparently only 40% of Lucy's entire body was discovered. And the most revealing part of the body, which is the skull, which is what scientists look to compare different anatomies of different organisms, the skull was not present. Lucy did not have a skull. They did not discover her skull. So that is a huge missing piece that would tell us a lot of information. Now, let's say they discovered this Lucy Lucy thing, and they say she was still very much ape-like, which is what scientists say. But even if this was true, even if she had some similarities, towards a human, which we don't know, but even if she did, how can we reconcile this as humans? And I want to point us to a verse in the Quran, in Surah Al-Ma'idah, and I'm going to pull it up on my phone. It is in chapter 5, Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 60, okay? And Allah says, basically talking about bad people, disbelievers, okay? And by disbelievers, I don't just mean somebody who's never heard, who's never heard the call of Islam, or who's never heard the call of monotheism. I'm talking about someone who literally hears it and rejects it out of arrogance. So Allah says, He became angry with them, this is the translation, and made of them apes and pigs and slaves of Taghut, right? He made of them apes and slaves, right? So we have a verse in the Quran telling us that God made of certain people, He turned them into apes, or He made of them apes and pigs, right? These kind of archaeological findings of Lucy and the like, these support the Quran as opposed to Darwin's theory, and I'll tell you why. Because as I said with Darwin's theory, you need a continuous kind of spectrum of fossils. But this passage in the Quran says, it doesn't say that it's continuous, it's a one-time occurrence, right? It could be a one-time, we don't know how many times it happened, but it doesn't require continuation, right? So, for example, Lucy may have possibly been this person that Allah is referring to, a person who was turned into an ape, right? It is possible, and this is something that scientists cannot deny, because either way, you're making a claim. And the evidence supports both, but I would say the evidence in this situation is more in line with what the Quran says. So I don't want to keep this video too long. Essentially, what we need to realize in conclusion is that Darwin's theory in and of itself has limitations. It cannot explain the origins of life, because it makes the assumption that everything can reproduce, but we need to explain how things can even get to the point where they can reproduce. Number two, it doesn't explain the origins of the universe, right? That it just doesn't even attempt to track. Number three, in terms of DNA evidence, we said that DNA evidence in and of itself is not conclusive. And number four, about the archaeological record, that is something that seriously needs to be considered to this day, because if the theory of evolution were true, if, for example, humans and apes share a common ancestor of apes, then we would expect to find millions of transitional halfway-like things. Not like, the odd one, like I said, which is supported by this Quranic verse. And lastly, I would like to leave us off with a Quranic verse, something that I've posed in my Darwinism class, and I've got very interesting responses, and I've talked to people who are basically doing PhDs or have done PhDs in, the philosophy of science, and I've asked them this, and they never really thought about it. And that is a verse from the Quran. I believe it's chapter 7, verse 36, but I could be wrong. Basically, Allah says, O children of Adam, we have brought down upon you clothing as adornment, and so you may cover your private parts, right? But the clothing of the righteous is better. Indeed, and that is a sign, perhaps you will remember. Right? I'm paraphrasing this as a translation, but clothing in and of itself is something that science cannot give us an answer to. Because I'll tell you this, like I'm wearing clothing right now, you're probably wearing clothing too. Why do animals not wear clothing? Why do animals not feel a sense of shame like we do, right? When a dog walks in the park with nothing on, that's totally normal. But if a human walks in the park with nothing on, that's a crime, and they could be in jail. So why is that, right? And whether humans are in cold climates, hot climates, all humans wear clothes. So inshallah, I'll leave you with that to think about. I hope I've explained the theory of evolution in a way that makes sense. If you have any questions, please visit our website, askamuslim.com. And always, if you ever have any questions about Islam, ask a Muslim. Thank you.